No, I will not accept this. You hear me? I will not accept this.
There are cases that walk into my courtroom carrying the quiet weight of everyday struggles. And then there are cases that march through those heavy doors, wrapped in the arrogance of untouchable power. Cases that arrive accompanied by expensive suits, flashing cameras, and a sense of entitlement so thick it practically suffocates the room. I want to make something absolutely clear right from the start. In all my years on this bench, I have never been intimidated by a title. A title doesn't bleed. A title doesn't have to look its community in the eye and explain why the system failed them. But this case, the one I am about to share with you today, tested the very foundation of what we call justice. It was a case where the entire city was holding its breath, waiting to see if the scales would tip the way they always had for the elite, or if something would finally change. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome. I am Judge Boyd, and the stories I share here are not fiction. They are real people, real betrayals, and real consequences. If you believe that the law should be a shield for the vulnerable and not a weapon for the wealthy, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. We are here every week, showing you what true accountability looks like. Let me take you back to a crisp Tuesday morning, October 14th. The atmosphere in the courthouse was completely different that day. It wasn't the usual quiet hum of minor disputes. The air was electric. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder with reporters and citizens who had lined up since dawn. I had a full docket, but everyone in that room was fixated on one specific name waiting at the bottom of the list: Senator Elias Vance. The charge sheet had been placed on my desk an hour before the doors opened. It read, "Bribery, wire fraud, and abuse of public trust." I have seen hundreds of theft cases, but stealing to survive is one thing. Selling out the very people who elected you is another entirely. My clerk looked at me with a tightness in her jaw as she handed over the files. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. We both knew the political machine was watching. When Senator Vance walked into my courtroom, he didn't look like a man facing years in prison. He looked like a man arriving at a gala thrown in his honor. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit, a perfectly knotted silk tie, and a smile that was entirely out of place. He walked with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who believed arrangements had already been made. The defense attorney beside him was Arthur Sterling. Sterling was the kind of lawyer who didn't argue the truth. He argued technicalities. He had a reputation for burying prosecutors in paperwork until they simply gave up. He organized his files on the table with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who was already calculating his victory lap. I recognized that posture. It wasn't the posture of a man defending innocence. It was the posture of a man who believed the justice system was just a machine, and he knew exactly which levers to pull. I called the court to order. Senator Vance stood when I said his name, but he didn't look back at the gallery. He didn't look at the dozen families sitting in the second row, clutching faded photographs and thick stacks of medical bills. They had come to this courtroom seeking something that had been stolen from them, and I want you to know that their quiet presence meant more to me than any politician's polished resume. I asked Senator Vance how he wished to plead. He offered a practiced, almost dismissive glance toward his attorney, then looked up at me. "Not guilty, Your Honor." His voice was smooth, perfectly calibrated for the microphones waiting outside. I asked the lead prosecutor to read the charge summary into the record. The details were methodical, yet devastating. According to the federal indictment, Senator Vance had accepted over $400,000 in undisclosed offshore accounts. In exchange, he had quietly forced through the zoning approval for a massive industrial chemical processing plant right in the middle of a working-class residential zone. The community of West Haven, a neighborhood built by factory workers and immigrants, had opposed the zoning change for years. They knew the risks. They had pleaded with the senator at town halls. He had looked them in the eye, shaken their hands, and promised to protect their homes. And then he sold them out behind closed doors. The plant went up. Within 2 years, the childhood respiratory illness rates in West Haven skyrocketed by 40%. The prosecutor read the name of the primary victim representing the class action impact statement, Maria Gonzalez. She was a single mother of 2, working double shifts at a local diner. Her youngest son, Leo, who was only 7, had developed severe chronic asthma, Just months after the plant began operating, Maria couldn't afford to move. She couldn't afford the specialist copays. She was trapped in a neighborhood that her own elected official had turned into a hazard zone for a paycheck. Attorney Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with a condescending sigh. He addressed the court with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who makes a living turning human tragedies into abstract statistics. He didn't look at Maria Gonzalez. He didn't acknowledge the stack of medical bills she was clutching so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "Your Honor, while we all sympathize with Miss Gonzalez and her son, tying my client's standard political lobbying to a generalized public health statistic is a massive overreach. The senator received campaign contributions, which is a protected and entirely legal part of our democratic process. The zoning board made the final decision. To call this bribery is not only legally unfounded, it is an insult to a man who has devoted 2 decades of his life to public service. I want you to understand exactly what it means to hear a defense like that in my courtroom. It means that the suffering of an entire neighborhood is just considered the cost of doing business. It means that if you launder corruption through the right committees and politely label it a campaign contribution, the law is simply supposed to look the other way. I stayed completely still. I watched Senator Vance. During his attorney's entire speech, Vance was casually examining his fingernails. He didn't even have the basic decency to pretend to care. I asked Maria if she wanted to say anything else. She stood up, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice was surprisingly steady. She looked right past Sterling and focused entirely on the senator. "I didn't come here for your sympathy," she said. "I came here because my son sleeps with an oxygen machine every single night, and the man who put it there is sitting in a custom suit bought with the money that poisoned him." I have spent years reading the silence in courtrooms. The silence after Maria spoke wasn't just quiet. It was the heavy sound of a community waiting to see if the system was entirely broken. Senator Vance finally looked up, not with guilt, but with a flicker of annoyance, like a man bothered by a fly at a summer picnic. He leaned over and whispered something to his lawyer. Sterling gave a small, confident nod in return. I saw that nod. They weren't worried yet. They had played this exact game 100 times before in 100 different rooms, and the house always won. But they hadn't played it in my courtroom. I turned my attention back to Attorney Sterling. He was still standing, waiting for me to nod, waiting for me to dismiss the charges based on his neat, sterile legal definitions. He wanted me to look at the law as a loophole, a technicality that protected the powerful. I asked the lead prosecutor, a sharp, unyielding woman named Sarah Jenkins, to present Exhibit D to the bench. I watched Sterling's face as the file was handed to my clerk. For the first time all morning, the absolute certainty in his eyes wavered. Just a fraction, but I saw it. Exhibit D wasn't a public campaign finance report. It wasn't a standard donor list. It was a printed transcript of a subpoenaed email chain from a private, heavily encrypted server belonging to the CEO of the chemical corporation. I placed the paper on my desk and smoothed it out. I didn't rush. I let the weight of the moment settle over the entire room. Then, I read the exchange aloud so that every reporter, every citizen, and every struggling parent in that gallery could hear exactly how their lives were traded away behind closed doors. The first email, dated 3 days before the crucial zoning vote, was from the CEO. It read, "The West Haven project is stalling. The locals are making too much noise at the town halls. We need this pushed through by Friday." The reply came from an unregistered alias account, an account that federal cybercrimes investigators had definitively traced to the private IP address of Senator Vance's own residence. The response was exactly 1 sentence long. I read it slowly, letting every single syllable echo in the high ceilings of the courtroom. "Wire the remaining 200,000 to the offshore account, and I will make the noise go away." I looked up from the paper. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. It was no longer the quiet of a community bracing for defeat. It was the absolute, breathless silence of a trap snapping shut. Senator Vance's hands, which had been so casually examining his fingernails just moments before, were now gripping the heavy oak edge of the defense table. His knuckles were bone white. The arrogant color had completely drained from his face, leaving behind the pale reality of a man who suddenly realized his power could not save him here. I looked directly at his attorney. "Counselor," I said, keeping my voice deliberately low and measured, "I have been on this bench a very long time. I know what a legal campaign contribution looks like. It is declared, it is transparent, it does not require an encrypted server, an offshore routing number, and it certainly does not involve a written promise to make the noise go away when that noise happens to be the desperate, breathless pleas of your own constituents." Sterling scrambled to his feet, knocking a heavy law book off the table in his panic. He was stammering, throwing out desperate legal jargon about admissibility, lack of context, and unauthorized data breaches. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I simply raised my hand, and the room froze. "Overruled," I said. "There is no context in the world, Mr. Sterling. That makes selling out a child's lungs for a deposit slip an acceptable defense in this courtroom." Senator Vance didn't look like a senator anymore. The polished mask of the elder statesman had cracked, and underneath was something much smaller and much more desperate. He looked like a thief caught with his hand in the jar, not because he felt guilty, but because he was furious he had been caught. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. He whispered something sharply to Sterling, who was frantically shuffling papers, trying to find some legal shield that hadn't already been shattered. I looked at the senator for a long moment. I let the silence of the courtroom weigh on him. This is the moment where most people in his position start to realize that their world is shrinking. I said, "Senator Vance, you spent 20 years telling this community that you were their champion. You spoke at their graduations, you attended their funerals, and you sat in their living rooms, promising them a better future. But these emails show us a different man. They show a man who viewed his public office as a private marketplace." Vance suddenly stood up. Sterling tried to grab his arm to pull him back down, but Vance pushed him away. He wasn't going to hide behind his lawyer anymore. He straightened his charcoal blazer, trying to summon that old, booming campaign trail voice. "Your Honor," he started, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and remaining pride. "You are taking a few lines of private correspondence and using them to dismantle a lifetime of service. I have brought billions in federal funding to this state. I have built bridges, schools, and hospitals. Does that not count for anything? Does one zoning dispute erase 20 years of progress?" I didn't answer him right away. I leaned forward, looking at the ledger of the victims that sat on the corner of my bench. "Senator," I said, my voice cold and steady, "a bridge built with one hand doesn't justify the poison you distributed with the other. You ask if your service counts. I'll tell you what counts in this courtroom. The $400,000 in that offshore account counts. The 40% increase in childhood asthma in West Haven counts. And the fact that Maria Gonzalez had to borrow money for an inhaler while you were buying a house in the Caribbean with your lobbying money that counts most of all." He opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to fail him. He looked out at the gallery, perhaps expecting to see the usual supporters, the lobbyists, or the sycophants who usually followed him, but they were gone. The only people left in those seats were the people of West Haven. They weren't cheering. They weren't clapping. They were just watching him with a cold, hard clarity that no amount of political spin could ever change. Attorney Sterling cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of control over the room. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a desperate, pleading expression. "Your Honor," he said, his voice dropping to a low, somber tone, "we must consider the totality of this man's life. Senator Vance is a father, a grandfather, and a pillar of this community. He has donated millions to local charities through his foundation. He has mentored dozens of young leaders. Are we really going to destroy a legacy of this magnitude over one mistake? Is there no room for mercy for a man who has given so much?" I want you to understand the danger of that argument. It's a technique used by the powerful to suggest that their good deeds should act as a credit limit they can draw from when they commit a crime. It suggests that if you give enough to a museum or a university, you've earned the right to poison a neighborhood. I looked at the senator. He was nodding along with his lawyer, his chest puffed out slightly, as if he expected me to congratulate him for his philanthropy. I leaned back in my chair and let my gaze travel from the senator to the rows of people behind him. I said, "Mr. Sterling, You speak of character as if it's something you can build on a stage with a microphone and a spotlight. But in this courtroom, character is what a man does when he thinks no one is looking. It's what he writes in an encrypted email when he thinks the noise of the poor won't reach the ears of the law. I picked up a single medical report from the file Sarah Jenkins had provided. You talk about his charity foundation. I continued. But did his foundation pay for Leo's nebulizer? Did his mentorship help Maria Gonzalez when she was sitting in a hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning because her son couldn't breathe? No. His foundation was a tax shield, and his mentorship was a network of influence. Real character isn't a PR campaign, Senator. Real character is protecting the people who have no power to give you anything in return. And on that count, you are bankrupt. The senator's face turned a dark, angry shade of red. He wasn't scared anymore. He was insulted. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. You have no idea how the world works, Boyd, he spat, ignoring Sterling's frantic attempts to silence him. You sit up there in your robes and play God, but people like me make the wheels turn. Without men like me, this city would be nothing. You're making a mistake. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned forward and looked him dead in the eye. The only mistake made in this room, Senator, was you believing that your wheels could turn over the lives of these families without eventually coming to a screeching halt. The silence that followed my words was different from any other silence that day. It wasn't a silence of anticipation. It was the silence of a vacuum. Senator Vance remained standing, his hands hovering over the table, his eyes locked onto mine with a mixture of disbelief and a dying spark of arrogance. He looked around the room one last time, perhaps hoping for a miracle, but the air in the courtroom had turned cold. The political elite, the lobbyists, the fixers, they weren't there. There was only the law and the people it was meant to protect. I picked up my gavel, but I didn't use it yet. I looked at Maria Gonzalez. I looked at the dozens of families who had lived in the shadow of that chemical plant. Then I turned back to the defendant. Senator Vance, I said, the defense has spent this entire trial arguing that your actions were part of a protected political process. They argued that your influence was a commodity and that your character was beyond reproach because of your canvassing public service. But the evidence, the encrypted messages, the offshore accounts, and the direct correlation between your signature and the suffering of West Haven tells a story that no legal jargon can hide. I paused, letting the weight of my next words settle. I find you guilty on all counts of bribery, wire fraud, and abuse of public trust. But we are not here just to check boxes on a legal form. We are here to address the hole you ripped in the fabric of this community. Sterling, the defense attorney, looked as though he were about to faint. He tried to speak, to offer one last plea for a suspended sentence or a fine that his client's wealthy donors would surely cover, but I cut him off with a single look. Mr. Sterling, you asked for mercy earlier. You asked me to consider the senator's legacy. I have considered it, and I've decided that his legacy shouldn't be a building with his name on it. It should be the restoration of the lives he compromised. This was the moment the energy in the room shifted. Everyone expected a standard prison sentence and a heavy fine. That's how the game is usually played. But as I prepared to deliver the final part of the sentence, the part that would later be described as the one sentence no one expected, I saw the senator's expression change from anger to a deep, visceral fear. He realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't going to be able to write a check to make the problem go away. He was about to face the one thing a man like him fears more than a cell: the total public loss of his untouchable status. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. Senator Vance stood there, his jaw tight, his expensive suit now looking like a shroud. He expected a fine. He expected a prison sentence that his lawyers would appeal for the next decade. But I wasn't looking at his lawyers. I was looking at Maria Gonzalez, who was holding her son's medical inhaler like a rosary. I leaned into the microphone, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the very back of the gallery. Senator Vance, you have spent your career building walls between yourself and the consequences of your choices. You've lived in a mansion while the children of West Haven lived in an infirmary. You think a prison cell is a punishment. For a man like you, a cell is just a place to hide. but I am not going to let you hide. I cleared my throat and delivered the sentence that would make headlines across the country the next morning. In addition to the maximum prison term, I am ordering the total seizure of your undisclosed offshore assets to be placed into a permanent, irrevocable medical trust for the children of West Haven. But here is the part you won't be able to buy your way out of. I am sentencing you to 5,000 hours of community service. You will not be picking up trash on a highway. You will serve those hours as an orderly at the West Haven Pediatric Clinic. You will be the one cleaning the floors. You will be the one restocking the oxygen tanks. And you will be the one looking into the eyes of every parent whose child is fighting for air because of the signature you sold. Vance's legs actually gave way. He slumped back into his chair, the untouchable senator finally broken by the one thing he couldn't manipulate, the truth of his own impact. Sterling tried to shout an objection about cruel and unusual punishment, but I didn't even look at him. I looked at Maria. For the first time that day, she let out a breath that didn't catch in her throat. She didn't cheer. She just closed her eyes and nodded. I stayed on the bench long after the officers led Vance away in handcuffs. I watched the room empty out. I've learned that there is a kind of mercy that lives inside true accountability. Vance didn't need a lecture. He needed a mirror. He needed to see that his power wasn't a shield, it was a responsibility he had discarded. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. This case reminds us all that justice isn't just about the person in the robe, it's about the person in the gallery. It's about the belief that no name is too big to fail and no person is too small to be heard. Take care of each other out there. And remember, in this courtroom and in life, the truth always finds its way home.